Okay, so this is the first set of notes for Unit 10, which is pretty much all about the Cold War. So we're going to start with the world the war created. All right, as normal, let's go ahead and start with all of our vocabulary words. Here they are. And then we'll start with the introduction. Okay, so when the United States dropped the atomic bombs on Japan in 1945, it, of course, very quickly ended World War II, but it also began the atomic age, which was really new and kind of like unimaginable for most people living in the world at the time. Now, again, the bomb did bring an almost immediate end to the Second World War, which everybody was very ecstatic about. But it also launched the United States and the world into this very much uncharted area and arena. Now, for people living in the United States in 1945, the announcements which would come that year were extraordinary and were life-changing. So the war is over. That's great. That's wonderful. And Americans began to imagine what a new and normal life might look like again. And let's go back to what was normal. The U.S. had bombed its way into one of the world's greatest superpowers, which, again, is we don't, as the United States, know what that is like until after World War II. So those who have been fighting in Europe or Asia, they really want to get home as fast as they can after the war, but some do have to end up staying in Germany and Japan to kind of manage the transition. For some women working in wartime production, the war's end meant a long absence of a husband or a boyfriend who would be coming home. So they would quit work, they would go get married or, continue to stay with their husband and raise a family. But not all women envisioned the world and the lifestyle after the war as returning back to being a housewife. They were exposed to other possibilities that life could offer. So for other women, they wanted to continue to work, and they didn't necessarily want to move back home if a wartime job had moved them, say, to Australia or even to a different state. So as for government and national issues, the once alliance between the U.S. and the USSR during World War II is now uneasy, and it made the post-war era of World War II one of the most difficult times ever. So let's start with part one with what is it like in the United States in 1945 after Japan finally surrenders and World War II is over with. So we're going to start with science, medicine, technology, and of course the bomb. So during World War II, the wonder drugs of penicillin and others really combated the infections and resulted in a dramatic reduction of battlefield deaths, which is great. So what they did after the war is these medicines would start to change the civilian world as well. By 1956, 80% of prescribed drugs had been invented after the beginning of World War II. So the vaccines ended traditional childhood diseases like whooping cough, diphtheria, mumps, and the measles. Then in 1955, a vaccine was found for the feared sickness of polio, which is the disease that FDR had. Now, people were growing taller, they're living longer, and thanks to advances in medicine and nutrition and hygiene, like you're living longer, but your health is better too, so you're living a better life. Now, in 1945, consumers were once again being introduced to a new and different modern conveniences that didn't necessarily have to deal with medicine. We're getting freezers, dishwashers, automatic transmissions in our cars, and even ballpoint pens are going to be distributed. Now, other technologies which were developed before World War II but not produced during the war years were now readily available again. Washing machines all the way to electric ranges. So remember that during World War II, no automobiles for private use were actually produced in the United States because everything was going to the war effort. But by 1947, there are new models replacing old vehicles, and people can buy the family car again. Now, while most households did have radios in 1945, only a very few had televisions, which at the time were, of course, black and white. Now, televisions had actually been invented in the early 1930s, introduced in 1939, but the production of TV stopped when the war years were occurring, which makes sense. And so television factories didn't make TVs, they made radar equipment instead. But after 1945 and into the 50s, televisions are going to rise in number. All right, now let's get to the bomb. So, hanging over all the advances, however, was the atomic bomb. Now, as Americans learned more and more about the bomb, they realized that the thing that ended World War II could end all of their improved health care and their newfound prosperity that we had after World War II. So the bomb might be a new form of protection since only the U.S. had it, but it was also a new threat. Now, some scientists proposed the voluntary sharing of the atomic technology to avoid an arms race with other countries. But President Truman decided that the safest course was for the U.S. to actually retain the sole knowledge of the nuclear bomb and keep it an American secret. However, in 1949, the U.S. was surprised to learn that the USSR had successfully tested their own atomic bomb. By this time, the World War II ally had actually become a potential enemy, and a potential enemy having an atomic bomb does not make Americans feel safe. So, suddenly, the U.S. was no longer protected by its unique control of the bomb. Soon, other countries had their own atomic bombs, such as Great Britain and France, but we're okay with them having bombs because they're our allies. Thus, the idea was debated on making a more powerful and a more deadly bomb. So, the atomic bomb depended on a nuclear fission, which is the splitting of an atom. But scientists knew that theoretically an even more powerful explosion could arise from nuclear fusion, which is the merging of atoms. Now, there was a lot of dispute on whether we should actually build a more powerful bomb when we're all kind of terrified of the first one. But when President Truman asked, can the Russians do it? And the scientists had to say yes, then the United States began working on a hydrogen bomb too, because we can't let Russia have a more powerful bomb than we did. So anyways, now the U.S. no longer had a monopoly on either the atomic or the hydrogen bomb, and fear really sweeps through the nation. So the U.S. does test its first hydrogen bomb in the Pacific in late of 1952, and of course, you can kind of see on this graph here, it shows you all of them, and then the Russians are going to do it in 1953. Now, the bombs the U.S. and the Russians had exploded are, we thought the atomic bomb was powerful. The H-bomb is so much more powerful. The U.S. had completely destroyed an island when they tested theirs in the Pacific, leaving a very large hole in the ocean floor. The explosion of the fireball went 5 miles into the sky and produced a mushroom cloud that was 27 miles high and 8 miles wide. So that's the H-bomb that the United States and Russia now have, which makes everybody extremely fearful. Now, after World War II in 1945, we have to deal with returning veterans, which causes the baby boom and leads to suburbia. So let's talk about this a little bit more. All right. So in August of 1945, as World War II ended, American men were in the military about 2/3. So we have about 12 million, which is about 2/3 of those between the ages of 18 and 35. All right. They had been through a brutal war, and now they wanted to get home and get on with their lives. And at that time, that meant settling down, getting married, having family. So coming home from the war was joyous, but it is also really difficult. Soldiers and sailors were desperately tired of the killing and the dying or even the boredom of war. And sometimes they did have a hard time adjusting to the civilian or the normal world where life had gone on without them and in which civilians could never really comprehend the horrors of war since they weren't there. The divorce rate is going to skyrocket, and the government is going to begin generous benefit programs to help the returning servicemen, so you get things like the GI Bill. Now, as well, many other changes occur while when our soldiers come home, but we're going to cover those in more detail in class, such as baby boomers, out-of-town suburbia, and the interstate highway system. Now, we do need to touch on the Great Migration, which I know has come up before. So, while white Americans moved to the suburbs, a new generation of African Americans moved from the south to the north. Again, during World War II, the rate of migration exploded. By 1960, half of the nation's African Americans lived in northern cities. Now, the migration of Latino people was happening at the same time. Many Puerto Ricans began moving to the U.S. mainland. The Mexican background also grew rapidly after World War II. But we have to keep in mind that during World War II, the U.S. allowed many Mexican farmers to temporarily come and work and enter the United States. So that way we had someone working our agricultural fields while, of course, many of our men were fighting a war or they were in some way working in the war industries. Now, the other thing that really happens very quickly after World War II is the United Nations. So while Americans are moving around the country, the rest of the planet was also in transition. Even before World War II ended, a series of international gatherings reshaped the political and economic climate of the coming post-world. Now, the United States would permit all of the nations of the world to debate issues, but couldn't really, enforce resolutions. But again, it's something really similar to the League of Nations that was thrown out pretty much after World War I by the United States. And this one has a few things that are a little bit different and seems to be more effective. So that's the first part, which is 1945. And what's going to happen is after World War II, it's going to lead us to the Cold War. So let's start and move on to part 2, which is the Cold War begins. All right, so the end of World War II raised 2 major issues. 1, the survival of the combatants, with the exception of the U.S. because they had been immensely destroyed since the war was fought on their home soil. America, very lucky in World War II that we didn't have to fight in like the continental United States, but Britain is bombed, France is bombed, Germany is bombed, places are destroyed. Okay, second issue, the shaping of the new world and the new political alliances. And these are not simple things to overcome, and they're not going to be things that just happen very quickly. All right, so the Cold War. All right, because there was no actual fighting, it is called a Cold War, whereas a hot war, you have actual fighting, like shooting at people, which would be like World War II. Okay, so the Cold War had very high tensions between the 2 new major powers of the world, the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, though the United States and the Soviet Union were allies during World War II, the war's end had exposed the countries' many ideological differences, and they became enemies, which we had kind of looked past those ideological differences during the war. So soon the world found Europe divided into 2 sections, the Western Democratic Europe, which is the blue here, and the Eastern Communist Europe, which is the red. So the imaginary line that was drawn between the West and the East, Winston Churchill called the Iron Curtain, and that on this map is the white line. So, as President Truman and his years as president move forward, what does he do? Because he's going to be our president in the beginning of the Cold War. Following World War II, the Soviet Union refused to recognize Poland's conservative government in exile, which was in England because Nazi Germany had taken over Poland during World War II. So a communist government took over Poland as well as neighboring countries like Hungary and Czechoslovakia. The U.S. and the Soviet Union both used propaganda following World War II to make it seem like the other country was the one trying to take over the world for its own glorious purposes. President Harry Truman reacted, though. So when Greece and Turkey were threatened to be taken over by communist insurgents and England could no longer prop them up, the President of the United States stepped in. And this is what Harry Truman says. He says, "I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures." So what this does is it creates the Truman Doctrine. And Truman was making it clear that containing communism would be the bedrock of the United States foreign policy. So if you need help to stay democratic, the United States is going to give you that help. Okay? So the doctrine would turn into the policy called containment, stating that the U.S. would not instigate any wars with the Soviet Union, but it would come to the defense of countries in danger of being taken over by the Soviet Union. The policy aimed to prevent a spread of communism and encourage the Soviets to abandon their aggression towards these countries which they were wanting to take over. Okay, so just really think of it as like you're containing communism in like a plastic container you would put your sandwich in. Now, following the Truman Doctrine, Truman announced plans for this massive economic aid to Western Europe called the Marshall Plan, which would send more than $12 billion to Europe to help rebuild its cities and economy. The whole idea is if your economy is thriving, there's no need for you to be communist because you have money. But anyways, in return for that money, the countries were expected to therefore become American allies. Stalin saw the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan as a direct assault, and it made him upset. The result was a divided Germany and a divided Berlin in Germany. The Soviets saw Berlin as a useful pressure point in the Cold War. So they decided to close off Western access to the city that could and would challenge the Truman and the Marshall Plan. So when they did this blockade, okay, or they blocked all the rail and highway access to Berlin in the spring of 1948, Truman decided to support the city with an airlift. In the weeks that followed, the Berlin airlift sent hundreds of U.S. planes every day to the airport in the western sector of Berlin. The city ended up being very well supplied, and West Berlin withstood this siege. Nevertheless, by the beginning of 1949, the Iron Curtain was more firmly in place than ever, and the Cold War, which had been developing since 1945, is actually real, and there's no denying it, and people are seeing it. But all these pictures here kind of show the Berlin airlift where they would just drop all these, food, supplies, and medicine off to West Berliners. Now, just as the crisis in Berlin was coming to an end, the U.S. Senate ratified American membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. Now, under NATO, each member agreed to treat an attack on anyone in the alliance from any source as an attack on all. Okay? Now, the really, really big deal about NATO is this treaty was the first time in American history ever that the United States had agreed to such a peacetime partnership. We had never been in an alliance before with any other country in a time of peace. We were fine with making alliances in war, but this is the first time we make a peacetime alliance. So what's happening at home during the Cold War? As Americans are trying to make sense of the Cold War, this Soviet manufacture of the atomic bomb and the communist takeover of China, some in Congress and beyond looked for internal enemies. Many politicians were worried about maintaining the security of the United States, but some in Congress stopped or really fought for political gain by fueling a new Red Scare, very similar to the one that had happened after World War I. They were like, this is how we can do it. So, industries created lists of those who were tainted and being charged for being, communists. And so they were called blacklists, and they prevented people from working. People got fired. They did it in Hollywood. They did it in Congress. It was all over the place. Now, one example is the Rosenbergs, who were investigated in 1950 and charged with being Soviet spies, as well as passing on the atomic secrets of the Soviets in 1951. Now, Mr. Rosenberg was a wartime engineer for the United States who had access to highly secretive data. The Rosenbergs, when they were asked, they always maintained their innocence, but they are actually executed in 1953 for being communist and, of course, giving information to the Soviets. So it's really clear in the 1950s or really 1950 and 1951 that it was virtually impossible for the Rosenbergs to actually receive a fair trial. And it's kind of real similar to the Salem witch hunts. It's like all somebody had to do with very, very little proof was to say, hey, you're communist, and like your job and life was ruined because Americans are absolutely terrified of communists. Now, right after the Rosenberg's investigation began, this Wisconsin Senator, Joseph McCarthy, gave a speech in which he claimed he had a list of active members of the Communist Party who worked for the federal government. Joseph McCarthy was the first elected official to try and make political gains by stirring up the fear of communism. He had been searching for a new political issue on which to build his re-election campaign for, and he thought he had found it in 1950 with the reaction many people had to the speech where he claimed he had a list of people who worked for the government that were of the Communist Party. So McCarthy was far more interested in his own fame than actually truly finding communists. And his Senate colleagues knew he was a pathological liar and that he lied about his military service as well. Nevertheless, few were willing to challenge McCarthy while the country was kind of caught up in the fear of communism, because if you challenged them, then maybe you were a communist. McCarthy never actually did name the names on his list that he said were communists, and the number kept shifting in different speeches, but he did end up ruining several people's careers, and he actually frightened many more into silence. So this whole attack became known as McCarthyism. Now, the Korean War is going to span for about 3 years. But anyways, on June 25th, 1950, the surprise of the U.S. leaders, the Army of North Korea attacked South Korea. Okay, now Korea was part of the world to which the U.S. planners had paid really very little attention to, but it was a place where the Cold War is going to end up turning very hot. So that's really all we're going to cover in the notes section here on the Korean War, and we'll cover it in more detail in class. All right, so let's move on to the last part of this notes, which is part 3, and it's Eisenhower's America and America's World. So Dwight Eisenhower is our next president. So you have Harry Truman, who's president at the end of World War II, and afterwards, and then you get Dwight Eisenhower, okay, or better known as Ike. So he is the famous leader of the Normandy invasions from World War II and was a very popular individual in the United States during the 1950s. Ike did not believe in returning to the 1920 style of isolationism after World War II. Okay, it didn't work after World War I. Anyways, and since many did not have the memory of the Great Depression, the 1950s are going to be surprisingly novel for Americans, and that helps Ike win the presidential election. Now, Eisenhower, okay? Oh, also keep in mind, he is able to balance the federal budget 3 times in his 8 years as president. That's really important, so I'm going to say it twice. All right, Eisenhower used a policy, and I skipped that. Let's go back up to the middle one. Eisenhower arrived in the White House prepared to really impose conservative values on the federal government. He also sought to balance the budget, cut federal spending, and ease government regulations. Remember, he balances the budget. It's the last time in United States history that the budget was balanced. Okay, so now let's get to his brinkmanship policy. Excuse me. All right, Eisenhower's policy of brinkmanship. So what is it? It's the practice of pushing dangerous events to the brink of disaster or the brink of war in order to achieve the most, the best possible outcome. That's how he looked at it. Now, this does require a buildup of nuclear weapons, and so he had to make cuts in the military budget to do this, which was difficult for him. So what he's really going to do is kind of cut the number of soldiers that we have enlisted and then make more bombs. Okay, so he did reduce the military spending by reducing troops and buying powerful weapon systems. Eisenhower also depended very heavily on the CIA, which was created during World War II to spy on the Axis countries, and then Harry Truman disbands it following the war years. However, Eisenhower did receive congressional authorization to recreate the CIA, so he does, and the CIA is used to spy on countries in which the U.S. feared would become communist. Now, Eisenhower had hoped that the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953 might improve the American-Soviet relations, and initially the new Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev offered hope. But the positive relationship didn't last long. The Soviets are going to advance to the nuclear arms, and they are going to explode their first H-bomb, which we've kind of already talked about, only 1 year after we did. So this causes the arms race in the United States, and it's pretty much who can have the most nuclear bombs or the most H-bombs, okay? Which is kind of a scary thing to think about. Now, in doing so, there's this little small satellite that makes a really big impact, okay? So on October 4th of 1957, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik, which is this picture here, which kind of looks like very sci-fi. But anyways, it's a space satellite, okay? And although Sputnik was small, about the size of a large beach ball weighing only 84 pounds, it is the first orbiting satellite ever to be launched and put into space, okay? A month later, a much larger Sputnik 2 is launched. It carries a dog that the Russians found on the street and then put her up in there. Anyways, as well, it's a scientific and medical instrument. So, while the Soviet Union celebrated, Americans are panicking. You know, the Soviets are clearly winning what the critics called the space race, and everybody thought that the Russians could just see what all Americans were doing, you know, in their homes because they had this satellite in the air. So, because of the U.S. spy planes over the Soviet Union, Eisenhower knew that although the Soviets might launch a satellite, that the United States actually was more ahead in missile development because he had been spying on them. So he's not as freaked out about Sputnik. However, he can't tell the American people, hey, I've been spying on the Soviet Union. Don't worry, we're actually more ahead. So everybody's still freaked out. Okay? Now, Eisenhower was discovered actually spying on the Soviets during what was called the U-2 incident. And this is where a spy plane is actually shot down. It's like 1,300 miles inside Russia flying, and it gets shot down. Now, Nikita Khrushchev announces that the United States, or to the United States, that he's found their spy plane and he has their captain. Okay. For the next 2 years, Khrushchev and Eisenhower had, a very unfriendly kind of relationship, if you want to say. In 1958, the administration proposed to create in 1958, the administration proposes to create the National Aeronautics and Space Agency, NASA, and before long, NASA scientists and engineers had launched their first U.S. satellite, and it kind of starts to close this gap between the Soviet Union and the United States. Not only do you have the arms race, you've got the space race. It's just this big race of who's better, the United States or the Soviet Union. So, to kind of wrap everything up, so the world in which World War II created changed nearly every aspect of military and civilian life. The experience of World War II would have a profound effect on American culture in the decade that followed the war, and the post-war era living patterns would just change drastically for Americans. There are some economic gains achieved during the war, which we know that, and throughout the post-war period. And at the end of World War II, it brought new attempts at international cooperation. So while enjoying the remarkable prosperity of the post-war era, more and more Americans became deeply concerned about the Soviet Union as well as the spread of communism. This is great. I have all this stuff. I have all this medicine, but I might get bombed and then I might die. Americans would witness their policy of containment to be tested and continue to fear the possibility of nuclear destruction. So in class, we'll kind of look at these a little bit more, but that gives you a pretty good base for this week.